Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Katie Novak. She is the founder and executive director of Novak Educational Consulting. Katie is an internationally renowned educational consultant who specializes in inclusive practices, universal design for learning, multi-tiered systems of support, and universally designed leadership. She is the author of 8 books, including the bestseller UDL Now. That's a teacher's guide to applying universal design for learning in today's classrooms. Katie's work has been highlighted in many, many publications, including Edutopia, Language Magazine, The Inclusion Lab, Huffington Post, ASCD Education Update, School Administrator, you name it. Katie's probably been highlighted or published there. So needless to say, Katie is an incredibly influential voice in education, and I'm so thrilled to have her on the podcast. So Katie, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great. Great to reconnect with you. We had a conversation a number of years ago. And of course, in the busyness of life, we sort of lost contact and didn't stay in touch. We're sort of on the, hey, we'll have a conversation every 6 years program. But so the podcast seemed like a perfect chance for us to reconnect. And it's been really great to reconnect with you and just catch up on your work and family and all that's happening for you. But the one thing I remember from our conversation is you talking about the duck pond. Am I remembering that right? The duck pond around your house or near your house?
Yes. So I live on Duck Pond Drive here in Massachusetts, and it's
Okay.
named Duck Pond because it was like built out in the woods essentially
Yeah.
on a duck pond. And
Okay.
so I abut conservation land. There's a lovely little duck pond behind my house, and we walk the dog around it every morning, and it's beautiful. And when you ask about the duck pond, I'm shocked that you remember that. It's such a small detail, but yes, I am here on the shores of the duck pond.
Yeah. Yeah. I like I said, I have this this skill for remembering obscure facts, but where my keys are half the time I can't find them, or where's my wallet, I don't know, but the stuff I deal with every day. But Katie, it's great to have you here, and I know listeners are going to look forward to hearing your expertise in UDL, because I think that is still UDL is still something that I think people understand to a point, but there's also some misunderstandings out there. So I think we have an opportunity here to really dig into UDL, what it is, what it's not, all of those different iterations. But I want to start with the autobiography, or your biography. Take us through the arc of your career, Katie. Talk about sort of how you started your career and how do you end up as a globally recognized leader and expert in the area of UDL?
By total accident. That's so I started off as a teacher. I was a high school English teacher first, and I started out my career in California. I'm actually from Massachusetts, but I got my graduate degree out there. I taught there for a couple years and then decided that I wanted to come home. And I wasn't able to find a high school job at that time. This was before you have like electronic ways that you can find jobs. So I would have to have my parents mail me the Boston Globe essentially. And I
Yeah.
applied to like every single district in Massachusetts that I could. And for the last 10 years that I taught, I was an English teacher in the middle school. I was a seventh grade English teacher. So I was in the classroom for 13 years, and I really wanted to stay in the classroom. I saw myself long term teaching, but I did go and get a doctorate. I graduated in 2009 because my dad was a college professor, and I saw that of like, I'll teach out my career like my mom. My mom's a fifth grade teacher, and then I can become like a college professor after I retire, like my dad. And so I had a doctorate and I was in the classroom. And by complete happenstance, the district that I was in, where I was teaching seventh grade, was selected to be a part of a big research study funded by the Gates Foundation called The Tale of Four Districts. And essentially, CAST, which is like the UDL mothership, they
Mhm.
created the concept of universal design for learning. They coined that framework. They were looking for four districts to follow throughout the course of a few years to determine like what does effective implementation look like
Mhm.
when you're scaling and optimizing a new initiative or a new framework. And so I was in the district, we received the funding, and a part of it was essentially going to like a 2-week intensive with CAST during the summer, and then having CAST come out like once a month for years to observe your classroom practice, to meet with you afterwards. And it was all about scaling the district. So they asked me if I wanted to be a part of it, and I was like, no, I'm not interested, thank you. And they're like, but you have a doctoral degree. Like, it's clear that you want to do something else. Like, this is a great opportunity for your distributed leadership. And I'm like, yeah, but no, thank you. Like, I'm pregnant with my first, and I feel like I sign up for everything. You end up with teachers who are pretty innovative and they just get slammed. So, I was piloting, looking at student work protocols, and I was coaching cross country, and I was running the school newspaper, and I was, piloting a full inclusion co-teaching model. And I'm like, go ask someone else. And then I was totally backed into a corner because they offered a stipend during the summer to do it. And so I was like, I can't say no to per diem pay in the summer. So
Right.
that is how I learned about UDL, totally by accident. And so I'm a seventh grade teacher, like so many other people, just loving my time with students. And I
Mhm.
attend this 2 week kind of, I guess you can call it, symposium in the summer to learn about UDL as a practitioner. And there was just so much data collection because I was a part of this study. And
Yeah.
so there were interviews, and, as a part of one of the interviews, they asked me, what would you have done differently about this 2 week, intensive universal design kind of experience? And I was like, to be honest, I probably would have universally designed it. And they were like, I'm sorry, what was that? I'm like, what you're telling me is that UDL is very much about like flexibility and voice and choice. We all were required to do the same thing for this 2 weeks.
Right.
And as the story goes, David Rose heard that and thought it was hilarious and reached out to me and said, how would you have designed it? And I told him, and he said, okay, come out to Harvard University and present at the Summer Institute. So my first ever presentation was at Harvard University's like international symposium in front of David Rose, the founder of UDL, as like this pistol of a kid who's going to show him universally designed professional development. And honest to goodness, the rest is history.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
became very close friends with Dr. David Rose. He is an absolute mentor of mine. I
Yeah.
became a part of the cast cadre. And then from there, I was a reading coordinator and ELL director. I was an
Mhm.
assistant superintendent of schools for
Yeah.
6 years. And now I'm consulting full time. But I
Yeah.
really honestly credit um, absolute happenstance and just naive stupidity to tell the director and the chief academic officer at CAS that I could do it better.
We all, I think, at times can look in our lives and say, I have these moments in life where I said something without thinking, and how's that going to turn out? And you just said what you said, and really, as you say, the rest is history, right? It's like careful what you say, Katie. You might
I
have
know.
an influence. Yeah, and to present in that setting as your first presentation, I mean, if you could handle that, you can handle anything.
Yeah,
That's
well,
for sure.
somebody came up to me afterwards and he said, "Do you do this like in other districts?" I'm like, "Yes." And no, I have no idea.
No, of
So I
course
had to
not.
like call a
Yeah,
bunch of my friends. I'm like, "How much do consultants charge?" Somebody just wanted me to like fly to their district.
that's
But
right.
like I honestly meant that. I meant it sincerely. I didn't mean it to be fresh, although I can be
Of
a little
course.
fresh.
Yeah,
Is that from my interpretation, it was all
yeah,
about supporting different tasks and formats at the same time. And
right.
although what I did was incredibly rich and I learned so much, it
Mhm.
was, now we're all going to jigsaw this article. Now we're all going to do this fishbowl.
Right.
And it was just, I was having a hard time kind of bridging what I was learning to what I was experiencing.
Yeah.
And so I just made a comment. And since then, I've been lucky to continue to work with CAST. They're the
Absolutely.
absolute best. And I can tell anyone looking for PL training is that everything they do is universally designed now.
They are. They are. And thanks to you, Katie, of course, right?
Oh, absolutely
Okay.
not just me.
Well, no, but you changed their thinking. There's no question about it. If the things played out the way you describe it, then absolutely you changed their way of thinking, and I think you had a huge influence on that. Okay, so let's dig into the fundamentals then. Let's talk about UDL, and sort of for there may be people listening who are quite familiar with UDL, but there may also be some people listening who they've heard of UDL or they've just started their UDL journey. So let's first talk about the big ideas and the fundamentals. How does UDL contrast with more conventional ways of planning, and why do you think it's so critical that educators be well versed in the principles of UDL?
So, UDL is really a way or a belief system to view how we plan for all learners to be successful. So the three core components are really that, first of all, you recognize what learner variability is in traditional education, we have been very incorrectly taught that labels mean something for learning. And I know this because I hear educators always saying, well, what does this look like for students with autism? Or what does this look like for students who have disabilities? Or what does this look like for language learners? No one in those groups is the same. Like, it's not like you can just take a bunch of language learners and be like, well, I know exactly what they need because of one part of their identity. We don't.
Right.
And variability is essentially that, regardless of our identity or intersectionality, that all of us have a really unique mix of strengths and weaknesses, but they're ever changing and they're really contextual. So, I am somebody who you would probably identify as being like a strong reader. You could hand me a book and I would be able to read it. I have the ability to decode. I have a lot of background knowledge. I have a strong vocabulary. That being said, if I don't have my contact lenses in, I cannot read because I cannot
Right.
see. And so my ability to be a reader is really contextual because it
Mhm.
means that I have to have corrective lenses on. I can't have a migraine. The lights can't be out. And that's that concept of variability. So the
Yeah.
first thing is that really recognizing that variability means that people are so ever changing that we cannot plan like we know what everybody needs without
Mhm.
allowing their involvement to say, okay, right now, this is what I need given the options that you've provided to me.
Right.
The second core component is that it's about firm goals, flexible means, is every learner deserves equal opportunities to access grade level instruction. That is not a privilege that we have the right to take away. I think
Right.
that sometimes we'll say it's too difficult, they can't do it. We have to reframe our thinking into they might not be able to access it in this way, or maybe we're not going to have the same exact performance at the end, but everybody deserves equal opportunities to access grade level rigor, to have high expectations, and to have lots of different options for getting there. And then the last one is really this concept of expert learning, which is that all learners, when given the opportunities to really get to know themselves, to reflect, to make choices, will learn about how to meet their own needs through learning. They'll learn the approaches that work best for them based on the context. And so when you're thinking about universal design, a lot of people will get into the weeds and they'll start thinking of it as like, this is a list of strategies. These are things that I can do, as opposed to these are things that I believe. I believe that there's beauty in variability and diversity. I
Right.
believe that all learners can access grade level rigor when I design differently. And I also believe that students can really partner with me in helping me create those pathways. But because of variability, I can never expect everyone to be doing the same exact thing in the same exact way at the same exact time, because it just simply equal inputs does not equate to equal outputs or equal opportunities.
Right.
So the UDL principles are essentially like, what are kind of the places that we can provide that flexibility because it's in service of those core beliefs: variability, firm goals, flexible means, and expert learning.
Yeah. Your comment about labels really struck me as I've had some recent conversations about how labels can be both a blessing and a curse in the sense that, obviously the labels are helpful when it comes to supplemental funding or it comes to kind of giving us a clue as to how we might support someone with autism, et cetera. But I'm finding more and more that the labels are starting to influence, and maybe it's just the longevity in the career, seeing the labels really starting to compartmentalize and create sort of this idea that groups are a monolith. You mentioned English language learners, and sometimes ELs are referred to as ELs when we realize that there are long-term ELs who have conversational fluency in English, but they have limited academic language. And then on the other hand, we have ELs who are very competent and proficient in academic subjects. They simply can't speak the language. And then we have ELs whose language deficiency is masking a learning disability. So the idea that you would just treat that group as a kind of monolith, the list goes on as to how we need to really focus on that variability and be a little bit more granular as opposed to the labels being restricting or diminishing in terms of the expectations we have for those learners. Let's take a closer look at UDL now and the guidelines one at a time. So we're going to start with providing multiple means of engagement. So walk us through what does that mean? So it's multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and then multiple means of action and expression. So let's start with engagement.
Sure. So think of those as like pathways to flexibility. So if we want all students to be truly engaged, then we have to make sure that all students are invested enough to give the task their attention and their commitment. So engagement is really this concept of how do we capture student interest, but then how do we get students to work toward goals that in many ways are going to be out of their reach. Learning is essentially building new knowledge. There is cognitive dissonance that happens during learning. And because of that, we have to recognize that we want students to go through that process of learning or unlearning, and that requires some sort of discomfort. So we have to provide them with the tools and the environment that allows them to keep working despite the discomfort. And
Mhm.
also we have to really focus on, self-regulation. How do we have them cope with that discomfort? And so
Mhm.
what we know is that just because of the variability of learners, there's, very, very different levels of scaffolding that will be necessary to allow students to keep working. And so
Mhm.
providing options like allowing students to work together, allowing students to get feedback from teachers at like multiple checkpoints, formative and diagnostic checkpoints, providing options for, self-regulation, for taking breaks, for reflecting, all of that will help more students to become motivated and purposeful. And so when we're looking at it, we're really thinking about the lens of variability and then potential barriers. So this is my goal. This is my firm goal. This is what I want all students to understand, or I want all students to be able to do. And I want them to like really stick with this. Like, it doesn't mean they're going to love it. UDL is not a fun meter, but they recognize that it's important enough to stick with it. But
Right.
to be able to stick with it, that challenge has to be productive as opposed to unproductive. And so when I
Mhm.
start thinking about what would prevent students from continuing to move forward, I start saying, well, some students might truly not have, essentially an idea of where to go next. They might be stuck, which is why I'm going to provide the option to, work with a partner, or to have a check-in with a small group with the teacher, or
Mhm.
to hand in work and revise that work. Okay, those all become options for all learners. So engagement is really about how do we allow students to continue to work towards really rigorous content, and how do we create an environment that allows them to be more motivated and more
Yeah.
purposeful. But thinking about that through the lens of we also want all students to be challenged. So this kind of goes back to like old school zone of proximal development
Right.
is, some students are going to need more challenge to be challenged, and some
Mhm.
students are going to need more support so they can be productive. And one of the most important parts of engagement is this concept of choice.
Yeah.
We are much more likely to work towards something that we ourselves have autonomy in selecting.
Right.
And so the more that we can say, given this firm goal, here's options that I can provide to students. As you're working, you can, hand in an early draft and get feedback. You can stop and reflect and think about what you need more support with. You can choose different materials or methods. That all comes down to what it really means to be engaged. It's to keep working when things get hard and to know how to navigate all those feelings that come with it.
Right. Am I right in thinking that you had said something in your response, removing barriers? Would I be right to think that if someone stopped, if you were on an elevator and somebody said, "What's UDL?" and you had two floors to tell them, that you would talk about, is removing barriers kind of the UDL epicenter? Is that the crux of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's variability helps us to recognize
Yeah.
barriers, but
Okay.
also I don't think that we can truly do that until we tap into people's voices,
Right.
because there's only so many barriers that I know of,
Mhm.
given my lens of like a middle class
Right.
educated white woman. And so
Right.
I maybe don't recognize all the barriers, which is why I
Mhm.
want to make sure that not only am I designing with variability in mind, but I'm also providing options for learners to share barriers they're facing that I may
Right.
not have anticipated.
Right. So it's not all teacher centered deciding ahead of time, but it's giving the opportunity for all of us to articulate what are the barriers to learning and try to remove those for sure. Okay, let's talk about multiple means of representation. What are we talking about there?
That's kind of the teaching portion, is when we're providing information to learners. Traditional education has provided that in only one way, which can be
Mhm.
really exclusionary. So if, my goal is that all students will understand the causes of the Civil War, and I'm going to teach them that just by lecturing,
Mhm.
there's going to be really significant barriers for students who struggle with auditory processing, for students who have hearing impairment, for
Mhm.
students who have challenges with memory or chunking information. And so multiple means of representation is essentially providing multiple methods for students to learn in ways that are accessible, with the language and symbols that they can understand, and that really taps into their background knowledge. So when we're
Mhm.
thinking about multiple means of representation, we're thinking about providing lots of visuals, unpacking language, giving students lots of options for how they can learn information. So, for instance, there's lots of ways to learn about the causes of the Civil War. So
Yeah.
you might have, some explicit instruction in a mini lesson, and then say to learners, okay, the goal is that you have to learn about some of these causes. And
Right.
so here are some pathways that you can choose. Now,
Mhm.
multiple means of representation also provides multiple means of engagement, because I'm going
Right.
to allow you to choose things that allow you to
Mhm.
kind of move forward. So I might say, here's a great documentary that you can watch. It has closed captions on it. This might be a
Mhm.
great first step to build background knowledge. If you think it would be better, here's a really good text that you can read or you can listen to, or you can choose to stay with me in a small group and I will unpack some of these. And that's how we're going to build our background knowledge.
Yeah.
What's so great about that is when you provide like access to digital. So if I say, here's a great article that you can read, if I hand it out in hard copy, that's a single means of representation. If
Right.
I provide it digitally, learners can translate it, they can enlarge the text, they can have a screen reader read it to them.
Right.
And so it's essentially providing flexible methods for students to learn and make sense of language. And so they can get the input. So the knowledge and the skills, because it has a landing space.
Mhm. It's I think, again, you bring up such a really good point about the overlap. And I think even though we're talking about these guidelines as separate, they sound like we're talking about them in separate silos. There's just each has an influence over the other in terms of, you're talking about representation has an influence on engagement. I think that's a really important idea to emphasize. Okay, multiple means of action and expression.
So this is what I often think of as people think of it simply as like assessment,
Yeah.
because, okay, multiple means of engagement. We have to get students motivated. We have to get them purposeful. We have to be really clear about the goals. We have to be flexible in our pathways towards the goals. We have to teach in a way that allows a really beautifully inclusive and diverse group of learners to kind of move forward and learn the information they need to learn. But then we also need them to express what they have learned in some way. And so
Right.
if representation is learn it, action and expression is prove to me what you learned, share it.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so when we think about action and expression, we think about assessment. UDL is much more focused on diagnostic and formative assessment
Yeah.
than summative assessment,
Mhm.
because clearly I'm much more motivated when I know that there are still opportunities to grow and to move forward.
Mhm.
Now, certainly, we live in a world where some things are going to be summative, but the real focus is how can we provide lots of different opportunities for students to express what they know so that we can better design learning environments in the future. We can better understand the variability of our classroom. And so we can provide really targeted, constructive feedback so students can move forward. And
Yeah.
so when we're thinking of action and expression, it really comes down to those firm goals again. Because if my goal is explain the causes of the Civil War, choose in your opinion, if someone were to ask you, what were some of the main causes of the Civil War here in the United States, what would be your answer? And given the flexibility of that actual goal, explain, students can create a video. They can write more of a traditional, document based paper. They might record a podcast where they're interviewing each other. There's actually quite a bit of flexibility in that task. But
Mhm.
sometimes students have to solve equations. Sometimes they have to write narratives. Those
Yeah.
are also very important skills. And so the question is, how do I design a task so all students will be able to write a narrative, and, all students will be able to solve an equation? And that goes back to the barriers again, because like,
Mhm.
why might some students not be able to solve an equation? Maybe they don't have very strong math facts. So I'm going to provide the option to use a calculator. I'm going to provide the option to use a math reference sheet. I'm going to give students options to work with me in a small group. And so the expression of knowledge is really about how will I and the learners know where we are as we're working towards this goal. So, when you think about engagement, representation, action, and expression, think about like motivation and purpose, teaching, and then assessment. But all of them are so interwoven that we really have to be consistently recognizing that it's not linear. It's instead like a big ball of yarn that
Yeah,
everything
exactly.
tied into itself.
Yeah. So how do you answer the question? Because I know you get it, and I get this question a lot too, but I'm interested in your response. You talked about students making a video, you talked about recording a podcast. And so you have students offering multiple sort of means of demonstrating their proficiency. And teachers will ask you, Katie, how am I supposed to assess all of that when they have all of these different formats? So how do you specifically address the assessment question with teachers?
I think it goes back to UDL is firm goals, flexible means. I am a very, very big supporter of competency based or standards based or goal based grading. So thinking about kind of holistically, and I think there's many ways to do this. I don't think there is a correct answer, but I think there's a wrong answer. And
Yeah,
the wrong answer is creating different criteria to grade every single thing. That's what you do
absolutely.
not want to do,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the question is really like, what is it that I am measuring?
Hmm.
And if I am looking for true content knowledge, I want students to express their understanding of something that happened historically. And as a part of that, they have to cite at least 4 primary source documents. Those can be speeches, those can be visuals, those can be things that they wrote, that were written or that they listened to. But like if the criteria is give me the answer, the
Hmm.
rubric would be, holistically, this is how I'm going to grade it. What I don't want to see in a rubric is like must have 10 slides in the
Right,
Google
right,
slide deck.
right,
The
right.
poster must have 4 colors. The
Hmm.
speech must be 3 minutes long. It's like, no,
Yeah.
just be really clear about
Right.
if you know this, this is holistically
Hmm.
what the final outcome is going to be, and be very, very proactive about this. This is how we're going to assess together whether or not you met this. I'm also a big fan of creating those rubrics with learners,
Hmm.
saying that like this is the goal. Let's talk about what a really great product will have.
Right.
And certainly there are times that we have to be more structured. If you're preparing students for an AP exam, we know that the AP board is looking for really specific outcomes. And again, it's not that it's not universal design to say to students like you're only going to have 3 pages. They're going to expect you to fill those
Hmm.
3 pages. This is how you're going to do it. But then the zoom back there is like, okay, so what would prevent you from being able to do this well? Have you not seen enough exemplars?
Hmm.
Do we need to create together kind of a formula for how to do this, and to move back that way? But again, the criteria needs to be very, very planful and intentional.
Yeah.
And I think that the way that you decide to grade it, certainly you could do it standards based, you could do holistic, you could do a
Hmm.
single point rubric. There's, I
Yeah.
think, lots of options once you get
For
there
sure.
that are solid. It's
Yeah.
just don't create a different rubric for every option.
Absolutely. And Katie, you're speaking my language here. Listeners, you'll remember a couple of segments on rubrics in the past. I call them task neutral learning focused rubrics, right? So the tasks are the means, the learning is what you're assessing. And Supercard has been a real proponent of the fact that, especially with performance assessment, too often teachers build their rubrics for the tasks, which means every time you change the task, you have to create new criteria, as opposed to certain learning goals run longitudinally through a semester or through a school year, and you can keep using the same criteria even though the iteration of the learning is changing. So the idea of task neutral but learning focused criteria, Katie, you're speaking my language. And the other part that I really appreciated and 100% agree with is the idea of getting rid of the criteria that talks about counting. So my expression is quality over counting. So rubrics should describe gradations of quality, not how many, right? So and I love that approach, and I knew what you were going to say, but I wanted to just sort of get your perspective on assessment, because I think sometimes people really do, with good intentions, misunderstand even summative assessment, in understanding that all evidence is evidence that can help you make a summative judgment. Summative doesn't have to be this epic event at the end of a unit. Summative is a moment in time where a teacher looks at the preponderance of evidence and asks him or herself, what is the degree to which the student has met the learning goals? And if we're talking about 4 gradations of quality on a scale, say a standards-based proficiency scale, as opposed to percentages, then it's actually a fairly straightforward decision to use your professional judgment to understand how to create that criteria and use that summative moment. So I think it's really important to know that even though in the moment teachers might be using the evidence formatively, all evidence can help us form a summative judgment. So I really appreciate that from your perspective. Now, how do teachers guard against, we see this with everything, kind of UDL light. I think I'm doing it. How do we prevent ourselves from thinking, all right, well, I'm doing UDL, but I'm really not? So what are some of the common ways in which teachers can maybe misrepresent UDL or just think they're doing it when it actually isn't doing it? What does UDL light look like?
So UDL light often looks like choices for the sake of choices.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that, oh my gosh, I have to fill up a choice board. I have to have 5 choices. I have to give students choices. It's that if I did not give students choices and I had a beautifully diverse, inclusive classroom with students with like varying levels of challenge and support needs, that I would be excluding students if I did not provide the option.
Right.
And so I think that many examples of quote unquote UDL or UDL light are people just giving students choices without being super planful about why we're eliminating barriers by providing those choices. So this is not like, oh, I'm just going to let my students do a paragraph or a poster because that would be more fun for some students. This is, I can anticipate that some learners really struggle with writing, and this is not a writing standard.
Right.
Now, if it is a writing standard, I'm going to have a different lens. But if I'm working on a standard that is not a writing standard, and I say that everyone has to write, that is a construct, a relevant thing that I am measuring.
Right.
And so I think that very few people really take the time to stop and say, like, what really is the goal? What are the barriers for moving towards that goal? And how can I eliminate them by providing flexibility? In how I'm going to engage students, how I'm going to allow students to learn this, and how, and I'm going to rewind that because I don't even like allow, because that sounds like there's too much power.
Right.
How am I going to design so students can choose how they're going to learn, knowing that of course students are not going to make great choices all the time. We don't make great choices all the time as adults. And, how do we allow the room to say to students, like, this is the goal, here are your options, really take some time. What is the best approach for you right now? Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. Also giving space and creating an environment where we say, what happens if you recognize that you didn't make a great choice? What then? We have to be ready to reflect and provide scaffolding. And so again, I think the first thing is the really intentional planning. And I just think that I know before I learned about UDL, I didn't do that. I thought about like, oh, I was an English teacher. Like we're reading Old Man and the Sea next. And so these are the activities I do with Old Man and the Sea, without saying like, okay, let me take out my goals. Let me take out my objectives for this course, objectives. What is it that all my learners have to know? What they have to be able to do? Which one am I really focusing on right now? What barriers would prevent students from doing that? And then how do I create those pathways? Another very common misconception is that UDL is differentiated instruction.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah, which it is not. UDL is a really proactive, planful way of designing to remove barriers because we believe in variability and firm goals and expert learning. Differentiated instruction is how do we respond to the needs of groups of students based on what formative assessment data suggests that students need. And so it's not ever UDL or DI, it's always UDL and DI. So when we're thinking about UDL, we're designing first best instruction. We're allowing all learners to take the time to reflect, to make choices, to move forward. When given formative assessment data, if I have 6 students who are really struggling with the task, who are not making progress, I of course am going to pull those 6 students into small group instruction for some targeted intervention.
Mhm.
And that is differentiated instruction. Now, Carol Tomlinson is very, very, very firm on flexible groupings. Okay.
Right.
It's not like these are my struggling kids, these are my
Yeah.
accelerated kids. It's
Yeah.
these kids nailed this task, and I think they might need an additional level of challenge.
Right.
These 3 kids really struggled with this task, but I'm not pulling kids based on some arbitrary label that I assign them.
Mhm.
So it's very flexible. But differentiated instruction is really about once we see, where our students are at, what options do we know we have to provide in response to
Right.
what students need. And
Mhm.
so there's this beautiful dance of, as I universally design instruction, I am very, very responsive to student feedback, which requires me to differentiate instruction sometimes for learners through the classroom. But that differentiated instruction actually leads me to universally design better the next time,
Right.
because it's like, wow, students shouldn't have struggled with that so much. What
Mhm.
could I have done design wise to minimize that struggle? And
Right.
so, as an instructor, I am very, very focused on universally designing instruction and also differentiating instruction when necessary. But I
Mhm.
see that many educators will create a lesson that says, like, struggling students will do this, and kids who are accelerated will do this. And
Mhm.
that's not even giving students the opportunity to try. They're not allowed to make those choices. So
Right.
think of differentiated instruction as teacher differentiated learning, which should
Mhm.
always supplement and not supplant self differentiated learning, which is what universal design for learning would require.
Yeah. Yeah. I was hoping you would go there because I was going to ask you about differentiated instruction. And I love the fact that rather than, which so often happens in education where we try to create contrasts for the sake of distinction and trying to one up or what, we don't do that, we do this. I love the fact that you talked about the and, not the or. It's not an either or choice, but there's a dance between the two for sure. I want to connect a few dots here with UDL. Now, as teachers and administrators might be thinking about UDL and 21st century competencies, right? So, how does UDL set teachers up or set schools up to be efficient and effective in helping students develop 21st century competencies? We're talking about critical thinking or creativity and innovation. We're talking about collaboration, communication, the 4 C's and beyond, social competence, all of these things. How does UDL really support that growth in 21st century skills?
I mean, expert learning is really focused on 21st century skills explicitly. Is that we want students to be critical thinkers. We want them to be problem solvers. We want them to build empathy. And yet, traditional school did not provide a lot of opportunities for students to build that.
Mhm.
I was a basketball player. And in order to get really good at basketball, I had to spend a lot of time dribbling and I had to spend a lot of time shooting. And I certainly didn't get all the baskets in, not even half of them. And when we think about becoming critical thinkers and becoming problem solvers, I think that teachers are really worried about stepping back and giving students the options to choose, which is requires critical thinking, which requires problem solving, to say, as you're working, if you get stuck, here are some options.
Right.
And teachers will always say to me, but what about the kids who need them and they don't get them? Or what about the kids who are going to choose them and they're just going to do it to take the easy way? And it's like, well, how do you expect anybody to be able to get in a shot on the basketball court if you don't give them a lot of time to shoot around?
Right.
And I think that we learn to make really good decisions by reflecting on the consequences of our maybe less effective decisions. And
Mhm.
so when we're talking about how do we help students to become, more better communicators and, and to understand more appropriately how to react to the task and the purpose, you have to give them space and get out of their way to learn that
Right.
and
Right.
then be there to provide that feedback. So if
Mhm.
I say to all my learners, okay, I'm going to use the Civil War example just because it's I think most people can connect with that. It's just regular content. We
Okay.
want you to explain why this war started. And when you look at that, when we say, all right, everyone, let's start off with the grading criteria. Let's start off with a goal. This is what ultimately you're going to learn. This is what ultimately you're going to share. Here's a number of different ways that you can learn it. So really think about what's best for you. Okay. I'm going to do a check-in tomorrow, and we're going to see what you've learned and what you're struggling with. And then you can decide to continue to move forward, or I might pull some of you in a small group just to check on some misconceptions. You're going to turn in a draft of your video or your outline next, or when we do that, right? Students become co-creators and co-teachers and co-learners, along with us. That's very different from everyone's going to read this chapter in the textbook, and then you're going to answer those 3 questions in your notebook in blue or black ink, and then you're going to leave an inch margin. So they're just robots. It's just straight up compliance. And I'm telling you that compliance is not one of the 21st century skills. Right? Like, just do what you're told, because we're literally competing with robots who do exactly what they're told. So we need to, when given a task, think about our own strengths, areas that we need support or challenge, and we have to be given the space to create that journey. And I just don't think that we do that enough. And then we're frustrated that students do not have those skills. And one of the most heartbreaking things for me is, in the spring, when COVID-19 kind of shut schools down, there were a lot of kids struggling. Kids shouldn't need teachers as much as they did to learn. The fact that so many students were struggling when they weren't right in front of a teacher is all the evidence you need that we need to allow students to build more independence, more critical thinking, more problem solving, and to get to know themselves as learners, as opposed to having this lifeline to someone who tells them this is what you need to learn.
Absolutely. And teachers mistakenly think that this is a zero-sum game, where the more students are involved, the more I back away. And it really isn't about that. This isn't a zero-sum game. It changes the work of teachers, right? It's not, teachers are doing different work, but they're still actively involved in the learning. I think that's one of the misunderstandings about, getting students more invested in their own learning, activating them as, creators of their own learning experiences. I think too often teachers see that as a zero-sum game where I now back away. So what would I be doing? You'll be doing a lot. In fact, it feels at times like teachers are doing more, but they're just doing different work. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I think it's different when people say, but this takes so much time. It doesn't. It doesn't take more time. It's just you can't add it to your plate without taking something off, which I think is like really important. That whenever people learn about new things, they're thinking about adding this. I'm talking about replacing this. There's things that you're doing right now that you're spending way too much time doing for kids what they could do for themselves. And that's some of the time that becomes like, I could plan a UDL lesson in front of my class. To say, all right, everyone, the next unit coming up is we're going to be talking about animal adaptations and, why that's important. And this is like at the end, you're going to be able to choose an animal and talk about, some of the adaptations they've made as far as, the food that they're eating and where they're living and all of that. And so like when you back up and you say to students, like, let's think about this goal, like what are some ways that you could share what you have learned at the end of this? Does anyone have any really cool, like, everybody has time for that, and it's creating relationships. It's empowering student voices and creativity. It's really like optimizing and capturing innovation, but you don't have to do all the work on your own. And, I think that so many times, like, teachers spend way too much time grading, given what the effect size is of self-reported grading and, and student providing, like doing reflection feedback or one-on-one conferences that are happening in class that actually can happen now because you've planned everything so great that students are like working on their own. Some kids are watching videos, some kids are revising. You can pull small groups. And I think that right now, many people struggle with how could I pull a small group for differentiated instruction, because they're picturing themselves in front of the classroom teaching. And that is not the way a universally designed classroom looks. It supports multiple tasks and formats at the same time. Certainly there is explicit instruction, but it's not taking up a 60-minute period, that's for sure.
Right. Absolutely. And it's interesting, just what your response there just made me think of something I've been saying for a lot of years now, which is, the importance of teachers developing their assessment literacy is not so that they become assessment experts. it's so they develop an expertise so they can teach the students how to do this on their own behalfs, how to recognize their own in their own learning, how to teach them how to self-assess, make inferences with criteria. I think that, the self-reporting and the self-feedback, the self-assessment, the peer assessment, all of that, I think, is a critical part. But if we don't have the capacity to help students understand how to do that, that can be another, to use the word, another barrier to our opportunities to have students to be fully activated in their learning. Okay, so we're going to finish up. I honestly, I could talk to you about UDL for 4 hours, but or longer. But we're going to finish up with this question: how does a teacher? Okay, so Katie, I'm a teacher. I want to get started. How do I get started? They understand UDL conceptually. They want to do it. They're energized about it, but they don't know where to begin. Like, how do I begin this? If I'm a novice, how do I begin this UDL journey?
I would really recommend asking for feedback from students and their parents and their families and their caregivers. I think that that's a really important first step, is to really ask students to think about what are the barriers that they are facing. And clearly, if you're working with very young kids, you'll have to phrase it like a little bit differently. But,
Mhm.
thinking about, are you challenged every single day in this class?
Mhm.
Do you do things in this classroom that you didn't think you'd ever be able to do? What are some ways that you're really effective when you're learning this way? Like things like that. There's a
Mhm.
lot of really good tools out there already that ask for student feedback, for engagement, reaching out to families, you know, um, I love serving your children with you. It's been like an absolute pleasure getting to know them. I'm looking to stretch my own practice by providing some different pathways for learners. These are some things that I'm going to try in the upcoming weeks. Vote on which one you think I should try first. Thank you for your patience as we navigate expert learning. I think that there is definitely underutilization of family and community engagement. And then also, I mean, we are serving the learners in front of us. And, if we say to them, what are some ways that you would love to show your understanding? What are some things that you would be interested in doing? You can start getting ideas for the options. Like even really young learners. I have a kindergartner, and his math teacher the other day said, I need all of you to practice your math facts when you're home. You can go on your iPad and you can do IXL math for 15 minutes, which is, just a computer program where you're just answering questions. You can work on the flashcards I sent home with you. So there's like addition flashcards that they could go through. They could play the Make 10 game, which is you just have a deck of cards. If I throw down a 6, you say 4. And then she said to them, you could choose other options. And so the class, some of them said, could we make a quiz for someone in our house? So my son made me a quiz, and I, wrote like 4+1, and I had to answer them, and then he had to correct it. And I put a couple of things that were wrong, and he noticed that I was wrong, but that was his idea. He's 5. Like,
Right.
you don't get younger than that in like like these 3, 4, 5 year olds. Like,
Yeah.
we could make a test for our parents, and it's like that's a great way to reflect on math fluency. But it
Right.
wasn't the teacher's idea, and so I think that in many ways we feel like we have to be the ones to come up with the options, and there are some options that are really far out there, and that I've
Right.
said, I just don't think there's any way that you could possibly show me that you understand sentence structure by doing that. Like, the
That's right.
goal is that you show that you understand sentence structure. Keep working on it. Maybe we're
Right.
just not there yet, but from what you
Right.
say right now, there is 0% chance that I could fill out this rubric based on what you're proposing. And that's okay too, but it's the
Yep.
conversation and the willingness to listen.
Yeah, I think that asking them, soliciting that information, tapping into their interests and what sort of drives them, I think is really really great advice. As I said, Katie, your expertise is impressive. Your energy is contagious. I'm definitely going to have you back on the podcast again to talk. Maybe we do a part 2 and we dig a little deeper into specific aspects of UDL. But I really appreciate you being here. We're going to finish up the interview with a segment I call 3 questions. I'm going to ask you 3 lighthearted questions so listeners can maybe get to know Katie a little bit on a personal level. Nothing too intrusive, of course. And then I have one more question for you at the end. So the first question I want to ask you, a fun question, lighthearted question, is a this or that kind of question.
Okay.
Okay,
I
and
love
it
it.
has to do with one of the most important issues in every household: toilet paper.
Okay.
Over or under?
I have no idea. I just shove it on. So I'm going to say I'm equal opportunity.
Okay.
Yeah.
UDL,
I
right?
mean, first of all, if somebody replaced the toilet paper, which would probably never happen, I'm a mom of four, I
Yeah,
would just rejoice that it's on. Okay.
fair
But
enough.
like what most often happens is I just get like the brown cardboard roll and then and I just shove it back on. So I choose both.
Okay, you choose both. That's fair enough. I will just say that I think people that put the toilet paper under have given up on life. I think
Okay.
that's
Wow. That's an
okay.
aggressive statement.
All right. So, two, if you were arrested for with no explanation,
Yeah.
what would your friends and family assume you had done?
Oh, it would be an act of civil disobedience, probably animal abuse. Yeah. Mhm.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We, no, it would definitely, one of my favorite quotes ever, my favorite TED talk of all time is Clint Smith's The Danger of Silence. And in it, he talks about Martin Luther King says that we will not, it's not that we'll remember the words of our enemies as much as we'll remember the silence of our friends.
Right.
And as I get older, I have overcome that like stuckness and that silence of like, why isn't anyone saying anything? And I'm going to say something.
Yeah.
And so, I find that, being in a public place and seeing, animal abuse or domestic abuse or child abuse, that is something
Mhm.
that I would definitely get involved in and be willing to take the risk of getting arrested for it.
There you go.
Peaceful,
Um,
of course.
peaceful, of course, right?
Yeah.
But speaking of, I think mine would be speeding. I think I'd probably end
Oh
up
gosh,
having.
no, I'm a super lame driver. No, it would be definitely like, you can't talk to her like that. Like, are you okay? But
Yeah,
then things like that tend to escalate.
sure, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, so third question.
Okay.
What is something that is super popular right now that you just find absolutely annoying?
Ooh, that is a great question. Let's see. Something super popular right now that I think is annoying. I have to think of all like my pet peeves here.
Right.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I have bought into a lot of the popular things right now. I'm like totally swayed by marketing. I'm going to go with, oh, you know what? I know Zoom social gatherings. No way. No way. Like my friends are like, we haven't seen you in 6 months. I'm like, well, you're going to have to wait another 6 months because I am not going on Zoom at like 10 o'clock at night to hang out. I'm on Zoom for 40 hours a week minimum to like
Yeah,
do this, but like at night, get me away from screens. Right now,
yeah.
I'm reading The Art of Gathering. It's lovely, but I
Okay.
need like a magazine or a book. I am not into Zoom socializing.
There you go. So no Zoom happy hours for Katie.
Nope.
That's
Nope. I'm not coming.
she's out.
I'll send you a
All
pic
right.
on my phone. I'll drink in
There you go.
just in my
Absolutely.
house.
All right. So we're going to finish up the podcast as I do with every interview with a question I've asked everyone who's come on the podcast. And it really has to do with success and happiness. It's a theme I'm kind of running through the podcast, of course. And so I want to ask you this question and just ask you from your perspective, if a random person stopped you on the street, um, appropriately social distance, of course, but if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them?
I would say that success, I always tell my kids this, is truly living the life that you want to live. I think that when you think about kind of your non-negotiables and what makes you really fulfilled and what makes you really happy, whatever life will serve that vision, I think is a good, beautiful, successful life.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely good advice. And living the life that you want to live makes you successful because we all get to choose what is the life I want to live, right? And so there is no standard for what success is, but success is setting that goal and reaching that. I love that. Katie, I really appreciate you joining me today and taking the time to talk UDL and all of that. Listeners, I would really encourage you to follow Katie on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is at Katie Novak UDL. Novak Educational Consulting is also on Facebook, so you can search that there, as well as Instagram. Right, so we have Instagram is you also have a at Novak underscore consulting, if I'm correct, on the Instagram posts as well, and all of the different ways that you can get a hold of Katie. Also, Katie, your website has lots of resources on it. Do you want to give people that website?
Yeah, sure. It's just novakeducation.com, Novak.
Yeah.
And there's new content added once a week. So I try to blog at least once a week. And we do a lot of podcasts. So in addition to sharing this out, that'll
Yeah.
be at the link called In the News.
Great, awesome, and lots of your book listings are there. Lots of great content as well. So that's fantastic resource as well. Also, ways to get a hold of you if schools are interested in having you work with them, or teachers to work with you, or schools to for PD sessions, things like that as well, right?
Yep, absolutely. I'm there.
Absolutely. Great. So Katie, again, thanks for joining me on the podcast. I look forward to next time, and appreciate all that you are doing to influence the world of education. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right.